Hello, and thank you for joining us for another Summer Series Best of edition of VLGA Connect. For this episode, we're going back to April, when the CEO of the VLGA, Kathryn Arndt, and I were joined by Ken Smith, Dean and CEO of the Australian and New Zealand School of Government, for a wide-ranging discussion about our system of government and the opportunity to reimagine the way governments serve constituents. It is my pleasure today to be joined by Kathryn Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA. Hi, Kathryn.
Hi there, Chris. How are you going today?
Very well, thank you. And you're here to join me, I know, with some excitement to speak with our special guest, Ken Smith, who's the Dean and CEO of ANSZOG. And we're talking about reimagining government. And a lot of the thinking that's been done since we're all hit by a pandemic last year, and I'm sure Ken's got all the answers for us on how we can avoid the mistakes of the past. Hi, Ken. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Chris. Hi, Kathryn. It's great to be with you.
Ken, perhaps just start for the uninitiated. Tell us about ANSZOG and what it stands for and what its line of work is.
Yeah, it's the Australia and New Zealand School of Government. So it is a body owned by the 10 governments, the Australia and New Zealand government and the 8 states and territories. And it's a network with 15 universities. And so fundamentally, we're about understanding demand from government and then providing a range of education, thought leadership, and research and advisory services to government. We've been in place for about 20 years. The first dean was Alan Fells, famous from the ACCC time. The second was Gary Banks, and I'm the third. But unlike Alan and Gary, I've come from a state government background primarily, and that was particularly for the last 30 years with the Queensland government.
And Ken, does the work of ANSZOG focus at the elected representative level, as well as, I know you do run a lot of programs for senior bureaucrats. Is there any focus of the work that you do at ANSZOG on that elected representative arm?
Yeah, as you said, Kathryn, it's mainly been directed at senior bureaucrats and other bureaucrats that are involved, within government. We've done some work, but it's been variable with both elected officials, ministers, and political staff. And we've actually probably our research and advisory work has done more in that space. So there are books being developed, for example, on the role of chiefs of staff and the role of political staff, and how they cross into the role of public servants and the relationship between public servants, ministers, and political staff. Obviously, within local government, that relationship is even closer than it is in many of the states and territories and at a Commonwealth level, where there's a constant interface between senior officials, but also, lots of officers of council and those elected to council, as well as, no doubt, as is occurring and has occurred really since about 1975, a growing influence of political advisors. And in a system that's, I'll say, Westminster-like in its focus, how that has changed the balance of relationships between those three areas. And I know not all local governments would necessarily have political advisors, but the bigger local government definitely do. And that I suppose that issue would be quite important for local government, as it is for the state and Commonwealth government.
Yes, and you're right there, Ken. I mean, Victoria is a little different to perhaps Queensland. In we have 79 municipalities. The scope of services delivered by local government in Victoria is not as extensive as the larger municipalities in Brisbane, where in fact the councillors do have staff who advise them. And it's a really interesting comparison you make. I think local government is unlike the other levels of government in terms of the role of the elected representative. And I was really pleased to note in your cohort of students in the, I think it's the Masters of Public Administration program, last year actually chose a local government project to do an evaluation of, and that was in fact one that the VLGA runs, and that was our Local Women Leading Change program. We received some funding from the state government to encourage women to stand for election in local government elections. So it was great to see that that got picked up, and will be a really useful tool, I think, in helping to increase diversity at that level. But Chris, perhaps it's time to ask Ken a little bit more about some of the programs, and we were really interested to learn more about the Reimagining Government series that ANSZOG has rolled out.
Yeah, just to comment on that issue. I mean, I think it's really clear that there's amazing variability within our local government system. As you've said, there are some regional governments in Australia that operate under local government legislation, or the equivalent of CBD city councils. But Brisbane, for example, is as big as some of the states and territories in terms of its budget and remit. And as a regional government has been in place since, I think, the mid-20s, 1920s, not 2020s. So you've got a long-term, diverse and actually quite large body that manages, a very big area. And then obviously there are local governments which are smaller population, even though they might be large geographic sort of footprint. So there's an incredible variation there in the nature of local government, in Australia. And that's important to consider when you're looking at the future of government.
I suspected this conversation could go in a number of directions, and you've also reminded me of the scandal that's going on in England at the moment around lobbyists, and on the advisor sort of angle. And I think that's another conversation we could potentially have, because it exercises my mind about what's different, given our system is so strongly based on the English system. What is different that's allowed that to happen there? And I don't know whether you've turned your mind to whether we're at risk of a similar sort of issue, or whether our compliance and interest schemes are stronger.
Look, I think the Greens Hill case, as we would now call it, is going to provide a lot of lessons about how systems operate, and what the value is of a professional, independent, non-partisan public service vis-a-vis where that intersects with lobbying arrangements, where it intersects with the political system. But clearly, the reason we need to reimagine government and rethink government is it's changed so dramatically. So the home of Westminster has real challenges in how Westminster and Whitehall operates, when you find that, as reported in the media, that laudable objectives by government to employ people from the private sector have potentially created tensions within the system, where those people have continued to be able to work privately as well as with government, and where there is a conflict between their government roles and significant shareholding interest. This isn't, a few shares. I mean, the person that was in that sort of chief procurement position had reportedly about £5 million of shares in the company that was then contracting back to government. So this raises huge issues about integrity, about why that got to that point, because there are, for all spheres of government, and sometimes we think they get in the way, but there are incredible, what John Keane calls monitory agencies to the democracy. So there's coverage of corruption commissioners of all spheres of government. There are coverage of auditors general. There are coverage by ombudsmen, by freedom of information commissioners, by privacy commissioners. So there's a whole set of monitoring institutions that are meant to provide some confidence about the integrity of the system. But the integrity of the system can only be determined by making sure that leaders in systems, and Chris, I know you've come from an elected position in local government, but we would argue that there has to be much more ingrained institutional integrity underpinning systems, that people need to think about ensuring that what they do is in the public interest, and that they maintain public trust, and that they think about these conflicts of interest very, very carefully. And it's not about rules. It's not about whether this technically is a criminal offence or not. That's not the test. The test is more fundamentally, is this the right thing to do? And am I operating in the public interest, or am I operating in a sectional interest? And the worst part of that is where that's potentially a personal interest for me, rather than testing this out to make sure that it's an interest for the community that we're there to serve.
So 3 things, if I may, Kathryn, before you ask your question, just to pick up on some things Ken said there. One, anyone who doesn't know what we're talking about, a quick Google of David Cameron lobbying scandal will find you myriad information about what's been happening in London. Secondly, Kathryn, I think this is fodder for a potential panel discussion around these sorts of issues, and could it happen here, or is our system strong enough to prevent it? And Ken, just to disabuse you, I was not an elected rep, I was a CEO, not
CEO,
wrong with being an elected rep, but I just thought I'd better clarify that as well.
Yeah, clear up the record.
Look, and what I just wanted to ask Ken and be really interested in your thoughts about how we achieve that level of integrity and also insight in our elected representatives, when of course the system is based on an adversarial process of elections and campaigning, usually on single policy issues, which from a local government perspective, of course, have no place in the council chamber once someone is elected. But that makes it, extraordinarily difficult, though, for those councillors to understand that their role is to make almost governance decisions on behalf of a range of stakeholders in the community. But yet then the election process comes around again, and it almost requires that these councillors, because in fact the community who vote them in don't necessarily understand the role of elected representatives at that level. But I think the same observations can also be made at both the state and federal level as well. So one of the things you talked about was the role of advisors, and I do recall that Nicholas Rees from the School of Government at Melbourne Uni, and also a councillor, a sitting councillor, in fact, Deputy Mayor of Melbourne, wrote a paper on, it was on our federal model of government, and one of the recommendations that he made in that, he co-authored it, and I just can't recall whether it was Tom Daly or some other academic. So I do apologise for that person not remembering who that was, but he did comment on the important role that advisors play and political staffers, and the fact that often the level of understanding of and even the lack of professional development that some of those staff bring with them creates risks for the elected representatives that they're advising. And there is now the McKinnon Institute here, and I'm sure you've heard of them, I think, who are trying to look at ways that really target sitting elected representatives, but also potential elected representatives in the future, to try and instill that all of those things that you just spoke about.
Yeah, and Kathryn, I think it's really important to put on record a couple of things. I mean, in terms of trust in government, again and again, there is greater trust by the community in government that's closest to them. So the decline in trust in Australia, which has been well recorded over a period of time, the major decline has been at federal level. At state level, it's sort of, there's been a small decline, but it's bumped along, at a particular level. But the levels of trust within local government are very, very high. And so, there's an old saying that, standing for election is like a poem. Sitting in government is a piece of literature. And the difference is, the narrative. So I think, the electoral process is really important. Competition in the electoral process is really important. But I think the community expect that once people are elected, they're elected to govern. And particularly now with 4-year fixed terms, that there has to be this switch, and we all need to pivot in our lives. Like, we've pivoted with COVID and we've moved online and, away from face-to-face arrangements. The pivot for people who, are part of our elected arrangement at any level is the pivot from the politics of an electoral cycle to the authority that comes with governing.
Yes.
And getting people to make that pivot is really important. That it's no good if you're there, for a 4-year term and you've got particular responsibilities legally and with authority. You can't keep on campaigning for 4 years because people expect good governance, and good governance requires certain sort of principles. So I think there's a real role for VLGA with elected officials and, obviously with staff, to build that capability of understanding their responsibilities during that period of governing, because that narrative, becomes, all important. It's not denying there will always be, a political process and that's going to be contestable, etc. But it's at the point you come to governing that you need to think very, very differently. And the electoral process is almost about how you deal with sectional interests.
Yeah.
Then when you're in government, good government is about the public interest. And good trust comes, increased trust comes when you balance and clearly operate in the public interest rather than sectional interest. Because if you just operate in a sectional interest, what we find is that the issues, impacting on any community change quite dramatically over time. Mm. And it's even speeding up. So therefore, you can't just hold on to, like a position that might have been, part of a sectional interest view at that point in time. Those issues change. And you can see at the moment, there's massive change occurring in opinions to climate change, as a result of bushfires, as a result of, what's happening internationally, so, the US throw a rock in the pool, they elect a new president. The new president has a very different view. It ripples, throughout the world. And so I think the environment in which we're operating is fast sort of changing. And it means that people, need to be able to then understand those changes and then communicate effectively why they're taking a particular position, and what that, why that's important for, a particular, local community that they're accountable to.
And are you suggesting, Ken, that perhaps organically elected representatives will start to understand this more and more because of the pace of those changes that you just spoke about? We also talked about their role once elected. And I've got to make the observation that sometimes the process of actually being pre-selected is so brutal that by the time they get to that elected stage, they're pretty battle weary as it is. And sometimes it's the last person left standing. So that, of course, raises a whole other conversation about about that process. Chris, should we go back to the Reimagining Government series? And did you have...
I just worry that that's rather bland and boring compared to what we've been talking about. But basically, Ken, last year you brought a whole heap of experts together in a series of panel discussions about reimagining government in the current environment. Let's cut to the chase. What did you decide at the end?
Look, what we've been talking about is consistent with that. I think one of the themes emerging was that that government, an important government principle is subsidiarity, and that we can, the principle of subsidiarity is down to an individual and household level, and government intervening in the best interests of that unit, and only intervening when it's going to improve the outcomes for that unit. So a big challenge for really national government and state government is to understand how there should be greater flexibility and responsiveness at a local level, and engagement. That it's not one size fits all, Chris. It's actually about how do you ensure that the issues impacting on different communities then impact on the budget, the way that service infrastructure operates, and that can't simply be a one size fits all out of Canberra or out of Melbourne for that matter. The needs of those communities, you need to readjust to what is occurring in those communities. And that's so if it's an Indigenous community, or if it's a community that is adjusting as a result of major economic adjustments like the Latrobe Valley. You need to, if you're going to be responsive, the issues occurring in Melbourne CBD now are very different from the Latrobe Valley, and that's very different from the Thursday Island community, which is very different from what's happening in different parts. So I think one of the big challenges of reimagining government is, in fact, as Churchill famously said, democracy is hopeless. I mean, but it's the best form of any government that we've got. Going back to that trust issue, the really interesting thing from my perspective, AJ Brown did some really interesting research over a period of time on this. People are more concerned about their engagement, and we all get caught up in saying, we're over-governed by having 3 levels of government. In fact, the evidence coming from the community is they saw logic in 4 levels of government in Australia: local, regional, state, and national. Now that confounded a lot of people. That was the major that was the major feedback from the community. It was the biggest majority of people saw no problem with 4 levels of government. They didn't think that the levels of government equated with efficiency. They equate that with responsiveness. And on some issues, people want greater say, in what is occurring within their community. And you could define that as NIMBYism, or you could define it that people in those areas really are vitally concerned about their input and their capacity for input. So I think one of the things about reimagining government is actually reimagining and developing the responsiveness to the community. And the good things that local government have done in a range of areas is actively engage the community in problem solving. And it doesn't mean that you just get NIMBY sort of feedback. If you engage people, if our democratic principles are not just representative, that is, you vote once every 4 years and you get what you vote and then you can vote them out. But if it's actually a democracy based on ongoing engagement informing people and then allowing people to be involved and have their views heard respectfully, trust will actually increase. And if you have confidence in the community will get beyond, NIMBYism. I don't want to be oversimplistic. I know that, I don't want that 4-story building next to me and all that sort of stuff. But I think if you engage with the community and they understand the trade-offs, you can get really very good results. And we know that more and more, rather than simply, sort of putting that freeway through that corridor and don't worry about consulting with everyone. You can get lots of really good feedback that says, well, have you thought about this rather than that? Have you thought about putting parks under a V line rather than put the rails along the ground? All that sort of stuff. The community, have a lot of good things to say. And if you engage people properly and inform, as well as not just ask people what they think, but inform people's thinking, that can actually really, assist the whole process. I think the COVID environment has just reinforced that. You need the community to be informed and on side. Otherwise, people aren't going to self-isolate. They're not going to do all the things that are going to protect the community. But as everyone, all leaders have said, the response to COVID is not about treatment. It's actually about engaging with the community to get the community to accept a responsibility. But that's so, as you know, when we're running out of water, if you engage with the community, they'll reduce their water consumption.
And just going back to that, it was AJ Brown from Griffith Uni, who did that research. I think we should clarify, just for our viewers, that when we talk about 4 levels of government, it's my understanding that doesn't necessarily in itself mean 4 levels of elected representatives necessarily, but picking up on your point, it's about almost that direct participation in our democratic processes by citizens themselves directly, as opposed to necessarily just through representative democratic processes such as, elected officials.
Yeah.
And that's a really interesting discussion in itself, I think, and perhaps for another day. But that opportunity, we've certainly seen it through COVID and the use of technology. There are ways for citizens to directly participate in democratic decision-making processes. In fact, the Local Government Act in Victoria has incorporated the new act, the principle of deliberative engagement as a prescriptive requirement now in local government's decision making. And that, of course, can occur in a variety of different ways and doesn't necessarily mean that those elected officials at that level of government are doing the engagement, but as a collective, their council is engaging with the community.
Going back to the reimagining government, it is about engagement. It's about how you create services, and there are challenges in the digital environment, but there's great opportunities. There are great opportunities. I mean, I was talking to a friend the other day. What it's done in terms of telehealth. I mean, I can now, link in with my GP by phone. I can get the script as a text, including repeat, whereas before one had to go into the GP surgery. So COVID has actually brought incredible range of innovation and confirmed that by engaging people and engaging their logical behaviours, we can actually this isn't too dramatic, I don't think. We can actually save people's lives. I mean, if, one role of government is community safety. And when I was involved, it was different in Queensland at the time, but it was cyclones and floods, etc. We were still working off informing people. The sit reps came to political leaders, an hour later would stand in front of the media. But by the time the sit reps were prepared and they went to political leaders and they went into the media, there could have been 4 or 5 hours difference from when we got the initial information. What technology has done, I mean, the bushfire stuff is amazing. So information that was previously only available to people in emergency services who would prepare the sit reps is now available on people's phones.
Yeah, that's right.
So people can make rational decisions as to whether they should leave, they should stay. So the technology itself and the trust with people that they will make logical decisions, and in the main, people do make really logical decisions, I think, has the potential to improve community safety massively. And so a lot of that is about, it's not simply saying, here's the information, you make a decision. It has to be backed up then by informing people, as you said, Kathryn, so people can make informed decisions based on the information that's available to them. But I think that's amazing development. Now, so there's all the stuff, about Facebook and use of privacy information and stuff like that. But then, there's always a two-edged sword to this. There's some really positive things that actually will improve community safety, that will improve public health and other opportunities by empowering people. And that to me, I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish about this, but it's really, really important that we see that there are two sides to this, and that if we look to protecting people on the privacy and the regulatory side, which is really important, but on the other side, see the great benefits that will come from this. Going back to Chris's point, it changes the relationship between people, public servants, and the community, because public servants are not the gatekeepers, they're facilitating access to information that empowers people.
I think that's a nice way to probably wrap up our conversation. And I know, Chris, you had lots of other questions. One of the things that I'd love to have Ken back on the program to talk about and explore is then the reluctance that there does still seem to be from other levels of government, particularly the federal and state levels of government, when it comes to this concept of subsidiarity and the role of local government and citizens at that level. But as I said, that's probably a whole other conversation.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Kathryn.
I've got a mental list of about 3 or 4 things out of that would be exploring. Ken, if you're happy to come back at some stage, we'd like to talk to you again on the program. But thank you for those insights today. It's been very, very useful, and I'm sure our audience would find it so as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Kathryn.
Thanks so much, Ken.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed it. I know Kathryn did. A wide-ranging discussion with Ken Smith, the Dean and CEO of ANSZOG, on reimagining government and so much more. We will have Ken back to talk about some of those other issues that came out of today's conversation. We hope you enjoyed that look back on one of the highlights of the year 2021 on VLGA Connect. There's more to come from our summer series Best of collection. I hope you can join us again soon.